does art stop and craft begin? Was able to integrate what we can recognize as craft, batik, with an eye that is the eye of an artist.
Hello and welcome to the Collector's Gallery of Art and our next segment of Let's Talk Art. I'm Romana Kaspar-Kraft and we're here today with art writer, art curator, art historian, teacher, Elizabeth Herbert. Welcome, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Romana.
Today we have a show on that is called Artists of Alberta, and it's all Alberta-based artists that were born or painted here or had studios here over some time. And it covers both historic and contemporary art. But today we're here to talk about the artist Clifford Robinson, and in particular his batiks. We have a number of his batiks as part of this show, and usually batiks are considered more of a craft form, but we're here with Elizabeth to talk more about his accomplishments as an Alberta artist and how these join craft and art together as a part of a modernist movement of art. Elizabeth, Clifford Robinson was quite an interesting character. He came to Alberta. He studied at the Banff School of Fine Arts, and in the 60s, actually, right from the early 60s, I believe, he began to do these batiks. But he was really also known as a painter and a printmaker.
Yes.
He also did sculpture.
Right.
Tell me your thoughts on his batiks and his work in general.
Well, insofar as the batiks are concerned, I think he took some direction from Marion Nicol, who is a better known artist and who took up batik kind of experimentally among many things that she was doing. But Clifford brought a unique sort of vision to his batiks. As a brief background to this, in the 40s, 50s, 60s in Alberta, there were strands of modernism, non-objective painting, many different kinds of stylistic influences, all at the same time. And I think in Robinson's work, you can see some of these different kinds of strands. Very special way of combining what was traditionally a craft technique, batik, with some of the discoveries of modern formalism. Even though this work, for example, looks very decorative. It's luminous color. One might think of stained glass, as the light seems to emanate from the fabric. But if you look a little more closely, you see that these outlined squares are somewhat irregular. For example, here we see a dark space between the edge of this square and the next one beside it, which gives the feeling that the square is moving a little bit across a space and coming out a little bit from the very flat plane. In other words, these squares are busy. They're not just sitting there looking decorative and pleasant. They actually have minds of their own, and they shift a little bit, and they shift laterally across the picture plane, and sometimes even look like they're bulging out. Now, it's interesting because, of course, when you hang a piece of fabric, there is space behind it, and it does move out. Fabric is fluid, right? And with the knowledge that the fabric is fluid and flows, he created these forms which echo the natural character, and you could say behavior, of the fabric. This is a very subtle sort of work where knowledge of form and space and the way our eyes perceive form and space on 2 dimensions, the knowledge is very deep and very precise. So, you know, there's more than you think at first. This work is full of emerging, colorful, light-filled forms, and it's also full of shadows that seem to recede a little bit. So there is a suggestion of a space behind the whole thing. Batik is very old. It was used in Indonesia for clothing. It was used for costumes in the Javanese puppet theater, the theater called Wayang Golek. So there's a venerable history behind batik. It is not just, you know, the t-shirts that started coming out in California in the 1960s. There is a historic and non-Western history to batik.
So Clifford Robinson was one of the few artists around at the time that was, apart from Max Bates, really working with the figure at all.
Yes, the figure wasn't the chosen form of most Alberta artists. This is landscape country. In fact, Henry George Glyde, who was an important figure in Alberta at that point, at the time we're talking about, found it almost impossible to sell his figurative works. So it is something very distinctive about Clifford Robinson. In his prints from the 40s and 50s, you see lots of figures which are not incredibly naturalistic, but still recognizable. And he was interested in the human element, and as well as the more kind of abstract formal construction of things. And he was also, for a time, working as a set designer for the CBC in Vancouver. So I say this with a view to pointing out that some of his designs are large, like the one we see here in the middle. They're figurative and abstracted, not completely abstract, and they are meant to be seen at a distance. So you find if you are very close to this work, it looks very abstract, but if you step back a few paces, you can see it resolve into the forms and volumes of 2 male figures. And traditionally in art, a figure is 3-dimensional looking because the artist has used light and shadow to imitate the effect of 3-dimensional form on 2 dimensions. This is old. This has been around since about 1400. But as I say, Clifford Robinson looked to history, was very aware of techniques of painting, of art history, of contemporary movements. So again, we have forms which look like they're flattened, but there is also movement of light across parts of this fabric that suggest a volume and moving outward toward the eye. And this is what an artist can do with a traditional craft medium. There's been, for hundreds of years, there's been a debate about where does art stop and craft begin? Why is something a craft and not art? Why is something art and not a craft? And that's a complicated story, and opinions vary. Here we see in the work of Clifford Robinson, someone, a very gifted artist working in Alberta, who was able to integrate what we can recognize as craft, batik, with an eye that is the eye of an artist.
Now, Clifford Robinson studied under artists like A.C. Leighton, H.G. Glide, and Phillips, and that's where some of his printmaking influences and desire to do printmaking came about. Where did that modernist view, what do you believe sparked that modernist interest in him that led to the formation of this Calgary group of artists that included Marian Nicol, Luke Lindo, W.L. Stevenson, and as well as Jock MacDonald?
Yeah, all of these artists were to various extents interested in modernism from influences from different directions. I think probably the most proximate influence for Cliff Robinson in this context is Marian Nicol, who was an abstract artist and whose command of formal elements was in a class of its own, not only in Alberta, but in Canada. So I think Clifford Robinson looked to Marian Nicol as a kind of mentor and also as an exemplar. What can you do with abstraction and craft together? That's a question that interested Marian Nicol, and I think that was something that was taken up by Clifford Robinson. But the influence is there, but Robinson's vision is quite powerful, quite unique, absolutely his own. And I think that's what makes him important in the context of Alberta art, is his own kind of synthesis of many different influences, but above all, his unique mastery of batik as an art form.
Clifford Robinson worked in many different mediums. He worked in batiks, he worked in oils, he worked as a ceramicist, he did printmaking. I've even found several examples from the 50s that he did in caustics, which is extremely rare. Mm-hmm. You've often referred to him as an outsider. Can you please explain that, what you mean by the outsider?
Well, I think Clifford Robinson felt himself to be excluded from mainstream life in a lot of ways. As a gay man in the middle of the 20th century, he really couldn't be himself in life. And he tended to, I think, identify with people who were at the fringes of mainstream society. An obvious example of this is the Doukhobors. Clifford Robinson was interested in the Doukhobor people and did several prints of the nude Doukhobor protesters, and in a respectful way. And I think there was a kind of fellow feeling there. his art celebrates the outsider in many ways. He himself felt like an outsider. This large batik that I'm going to talk about next does, I think, incorporate some of the iconography of the female nude that is familiar to us from looking at his Doukhobor prints. Basically, what we have here is a theater scene. So as observers, we are looking at observers, and we are looking at what they are looking at, which is not explicitly clear as the image is quite abstract. But if you look at the top, you can see the nude figures, a stage set, which on the viewer's right side looks to be framed by a kind of Greek column that's very dreamlike and abstracted and wavy. There seems to be a curtain, black folds of a curtain hanging down that demarcates the space in the image between the audience and the play.
And it's an image that many artists have
Oh, yeah.
executed. I think of Secret or some of the other, the post-impressionists.
Exactly.
Like Toulouse-Lautrec
Seurat.
or Seurat.
Yeah, yes.
Or who else?
Degas, Seurat.
Degas,
yeah,
absolutely.
Yes. In fact, people in the Calgary group, adjacent to the Calgary group, like John Snow, for example, Maxwell Bates, were deeply interested in modernist theater, and I think, like them, Robinson found it a kind of point of interest to play around with the idea of image, that which is being seen, that which is being witnessed, what is real, what is imagined. So these are things to think about when we look at a work like this.
Thank you very much for joining us in exploring Clifford Robinson, and in particular his batik works. Thank you, Elizabeth,
My
for
pleasure.
being part of this and exploring his batiks with us. If you're interested, please subscribe to our YouTube video. You can click on the link below, and stay tuned for our next Let's Talk Art. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Goodbye from the Collectors Gallery.